The perverse logic of capitalism would have it that there is something inherently undemocratic about the proposition that wealth should belong to the majority who produce it rather than the idle minority who own the means of creating it. To suggest that the world and everything in it should belong to dockers and dustmen, teachers and office workers, nurses and miners, factory machinists, to the working class who produce the wealth of the world, is dismissed by the Reagans and the Thatchers and the Foots and the Andropods as a conception of democracy which is at best naive and at worst subversive. Capitalism cannot cope with democracy any more than religion can cope with science. Indeed, there are vicars who approvingly quote from Darwin and claim to indulge in moments of rationality between their prayers, just as there are capitalists who like the sound of equality between the rich and the poor and pontificate occasionally about schemes to allow the inmates of progressive prisons to elect their own governors. But the democratisation of the profit system is an illusory project because the class monopoly of capital can never be amenable to majority decision-making. Those who own property control it. To leave ownership in the hands of a privileged minority and then pass control to the dispossessed majority, which is the objective of capitalist democracy, is bound to be a failure. Of course, these lessons about how essentially undemocratic capitalism is are not learned without experience. Before workers could know the barriers of capitalist liberty, they had to test them out. And in testing them out, they were bound to confront the tyranny of the privileged, who will only smile at you as long as you are prepared to leave them alone. This lecture is about the first mass movement of the working class, which sought to test the democratic potential of the capitalist system. I'm going to show how that movement failed in its bid to democratise the capitalist state in the interest of the working class. But in particular, what I want to consider is the wing of that mass movement, the Chartist movement, which was associated with men like Bronterre O'Brien and, to a lesser extent, George Harney and Ernest Jones. And I will show how these workers made the important and vital political leap from political to social democracy, how they went beyond asking for political reform of the system and began to ask for a social rearrangement of society. The fundamental political contention of this lecture should be stated explicitly right now at the beginning. It's far too often lectures are given by people outside of the Socialist Party and you never find out what their political message is until they finish giving it, and normally long after that. The contention is that there can be no worthwhile struggle for meaningful democracy which is not also a struggle for the new social system of socialism. The anti-socialist democrat is a fake. The undemocratic nature of capitalism is not a myth which has been invented by Karl Marx or the Socialist Party of Great Britain. Until relatively recently, the spokesmen for capital were quite open about the fact that the running of their system was for the wealth owners and not the wealth producers. Consider, for example, the words of Jeremiah Dyson, MP, when confronted in 1770 by the proposition that workers should be given the vote. This is what he said: "I am an enemy to tyranny, sir, and therefore I cannot without indignation hear this House threatened with the most preposterous and all tyranny, that of a mob, to insinuate that the measures of a legislative body should be influenced by the rabble is to insinuate that all government should be at an end." According to Edmund Burke, who was another spokesman concerned with preserving the access to the state to those who own property, he said, "The sovereignty of the people was the most false, wicked and mischievous doctrine that ever could be preached to them. The moment that equality and the sovereignty of the people was adopted as the rule of government, property would be at an end." The essence of these remarks is that those who have power over property must have power over the state, that is to say the government and the armed forces. But this power does not remain static. As the 18th century closed, a sharp division emerged between those who owned wealth in the form of land and those who had accumulated vast amounts of industrial capital during the Industrial Revolution in the latter part of the 18th century. This class struggle, which to some extent was a mighty battle between competing factions within the ruling class, had the byproduct of creating a new ideological language, a political vocabulary arising out of the class aspirations of the emergent industrial capitalists. They resented the oligarchic privileges of the entrenched aristocracy. All this talk about divine right, the privilege of the aristocracy, seeing these as feudal remnants, the aspirant industrial capitalists spouted the rhetoric of liberal democracy. They argued the case for equality and freedom and fraternity and liberalism within the state. The deceptive promise of freedom under capitalism won supporters to the industrial capitalists from within the working class. In 1832, when the Tory-dominated House of Lords persistently blocked the Whig Reform Act, which was intended to extend the right to vote to the industrial capitalists while leaving the working class disenfranchised, this caused thousands of workers to riot in the streets, demanding that the House of Lords allow the industrial capitalists to gain their access into Parliament. It was their tragically misplaced hope that by helping their economic masters to political ascendancy, they would be repaid in kind. And they were repaid in kind after the industrial capitalists gained control of Parliament. They were repaid by the setting up of the barbaric workhouses which punished the workers for the crime of being destitute, and the tyrannical rule over the system of exploitation by the exploiting class, which was the hallmark of 19th century control of Parliament by industrial capitalists. Having climbed to power on the backs of the working class, the new industrial capitalist rulers decided that it was on the workers' backs that they would stay. Disappointment and anger with Whig rule was not the only impetus for the emergence of the new working class movement of Chartism. The early 19th century also witnessed the development of a number of ideas which began to explain the wretchedness and inequality of the new industrial system. Indeed, the critics who objected to capitalism and tried to explain it were often motivated by moral indignation rather than materialist class analysis. Some of them were utopians and seekers after the revival of the old aristocratic conditions. Most of them proposed no serious alternative to the system which they so eloquently and ably attacked. But an examination of what they said is nonetheless valuable, because great ideas, including that of socialism, do not emerge complete from the minds of geniuses, however much, incidentally, the Marx worshippers might suggest that that is so. They develop dialectically out of earlier ideas and experiences and experiments, and socialism didn't come ready-made, it grew out of these earlier, to some extent, utopian criticisms. Three thinkers can be briefly considered. The first is Thomas Hodgkin, who was a retired naval officer. He took his starting point at the labour theory of value, as explained not by Karl Marx, but by the man who earlier formulated it from a capitalist point of view, David Ricardo. According to this theory, which was later to be the main political economy of Marxism, labour is the source of all value. This was a fundamental break in economic theory. It was labour which was the source of wealth, labour which was the source of value. Hodgkin's conclusion was quite simple. If labour creates the wealth and its value, why should not labour receive its full fruits, rather than having a system where workers only receive back a part of what they produce, the remainder going to the capitalists in the form of rent, interest and profit? In 1825, Hodgkin wrote a book called Labour Defended Against the Claims of Capital, in which he outlined the principal arguments of what later began to be called Ricardian socialism. A quotation from that book is in order now.
Before a labourer can have a loaf of bread, he must give a quantity of labour more than the loaf costs. By all that quantity which pays the profit of the farmer, the corn dealer, the miller and the baker, with profit on all the buildings they use. And he must moreover pay with the produce of his labour the rent of the landlord. Whether there are corn laws or not, the capitalist must allow the labourer to subsist. And as long as his claims are granted and acted on, he will never allow him to do more. I am certain, however, that till the triumph of labour be complete, till productive industry alone be opulent, and till idleness alone be poor, till the admirable maxim that he who sows shall reap be solidly established, till the right of property shall be founded on the principles of justice, and not on those of slavery, till man shall be held more in honour than the clod he treads on or the machine he guides, there cannot, and there ought not to be, either peace on earth or goodwill amongst men.
So that was Hodgkin. Very interesting stuff. But he was only a critic. He was only a critic of capitalism. Hodgkin, when it came to providing an alternative, argued that there should be a society based upon the free competition between independent producers, a kind of a small-scale, backward-looking capitalism. That's because that's as far as his particular political vision went. It was another thinker in the same period, William Thompson, who was the first to argue a case for what he called mutual cooperation and equal distribution. It was one of the first major outlines of the socialist idea in British conditions. In 1826, William Thompson wrote a book called Labour Rewarded. He specially chose that title because Hodgkin had called his Labour Defended, and he wanted to call his Labour Rewarded. He wanted to look at the alternatives to capitalism. And here we have an example, 20 years before Marx was publishing his earliest analyses of capitalist economics, of Thompson explaining the essential economic contradictions of the profit system. Listen to it now, and by and large, what Thompson had to say about capitalism that long ago is something which was a strikingly original and innovative analysis.
How comes it that a nation abounding more than any other in the rude materials of wealth, in machinery, dwellings and food, in intelligent and industrious producers, with all the apparent means of happiness, with all the outward semblances of happiness exhibited by a small and rich portion of the community, should still pine in privation? How comes it that the fruits of the labour of the industrious, after years of incessant and successful exertion, are mysteriously and without imputation of fault to them, without any convulsion of nature, swept away? Why is it that the system enriches the few at the expense of the mass of producers, to make the poverty of the poor more helpless, to throw back the middling classes upon the poor, that a few may be enabled not only to accumulate in perniciously large masses the national capital, but also by means of such accumulations to command the products of the yearly labour of the community? The idle possessor of the inanimate instruments of production not only secures to himself by their possession as much enjoyment as the most diligent and skillful of the real efficient producers, but in proportion to the amount of his accumulations, by whatever means acquired, he produces 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times as much of the articles of wealth, the product of labour and the means of enjoyment, as the utmost labour of such efficient producers can procure for them.
There you are. Well, this is all very good, basically socialist stuff. Sounds like Ron on the outdoor platform, that sort of thing. So, coinciding with these insights into capitalism, and to some extent preceding them as well, there occurred plans for utopian socialist communities. The greatest thinker behind these was undoubtedly the capitalist Robert Owen, who engaged in some well-meant but ultimately futile attempts to create small communal islands of socialism within the ocean of the profit system. After the failure of these projects, Owen turned to a primitive form of syndicalism. These syndicalist ideas were to argue that if only the workers could form one grand union, a union taking in every worker in the land, a combination of the entire labouring class, the capitalists would be bound to defer to the wishes of the wealth producers. Owen formed this. He formed the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union, and he won hundreds of thousands of workers to its ranks. It was by far the biggest working class movement that had ever been known up until that time. And what happened? The bosses owned the means of production. The union members in the Grand National were told that they must either leave or face lockouts. Some of them attempted to fight against this. In Derby there was a strike which lasted for about 5 months of the building workers, but they couldn't. The majority of the union membership crumbled and the masters won the day. But of course every defeat for the working class provides its own lesson. The failure of this early form of syndicalism led many workers in the direction of the new political democratic ideas. They began to think that they couldn't deal with things purely in an industrial form. They had to start trying to do it in a political one. For example, the first political weekly newspaper of the working class in Manchester, which is called The Voice of the People, announced in its first issue in January 1831 that, I quote, "Labour is the source of wealth. The working men are the support of the middle and upper classes. They are the nerves and soul of the process of production, and therefore of the nation." Now, it's a first principle of exerting political strength that one should know how strong one is to start with. And by the early 1830s, the British working class was beginning to test its strength, beginning to find out what it could do, and just as importantly, what it could not do. There's one other factor which helped workers in Britain to find out their own strength, something which happened across the sea. This was the experience of the French Revolution. Here they had seen how history could be made by ordinary people, how by gathering together, spreading ideas, publishing pamphlets, holding meetings, you could shake and remove a seemingly irremovable establishment and depose the highest of powers. So, by the beginning of the 19th century, workers began to meet and talk and plan. Where did they meet? For many of them, it was in the mechanics institutes that were growing up in the 1830s, places of working class self-instruction. But for many more, it was above pubs very much like this, in rooms very much like this, with talks very much like this. And just like socialists today, they would enthuse about the coming changes, and they would move resolutions, and they would move amendments, and not infrequently they would shout out of turn when somebody else was talking. Comrade Chairman knows all about that. And in his passages in the life of a radical, Samuel Bamford, a Lancashire weaver, he gives a vivid account of one of these early working class radical meetings. And it's worth hearing it. And anyone in the Socialist Party of Great Britain will have more than a slight sense of déjà vu.
Every man would have his half pint of porter before him. Many would be speaking at once, and the hum and confusion would be such as gave an idea of there being more talkers than thinkers, more speakers than listeners. Presently order would be called, and comparative silence would ensue. A speaker, stranger or citizen, would be announced with much courtesy and compliment. Hear, hear, hear would follow, with clapping of hands and knocking of knuckles on the tables till the half-pint's done. Then a speech with compliments to some brother orator or popular statesman. Next, a resolution in favour of parliamentary reform, and a speech to second it. An amendment on some minor point would follow, a seconding of that. A breach of order by some individual of warm temperament, half a dozen would rise to set him right, a dozen to put him down, and the vociferation and gesticulation would become loud and confounding.
Sounds like the EC or a shoot.
Well, it was out of such a meeting in the early 1830s that the National Union of the Working Classes was formed, and that was formed in 1831. Out of the National Union of the Working Classes emerged the London Working Men's Association, and out of that emerged the famous six-point charter which provided the basis for the democratic movement which was to dominate working class radicalism for nearly 2 decades. Now, it's tempting to go on to give a history of Chartism, but such an exercise would miss the theme which I want to concentrate upon this evening. As a movement, Chartism was an alliance. It contained bankers in Birmingham who wanted parliamentary reform because they wanted currency reform. It contained people like Fergus O'Connor, who, as well as wanting political reform, was also particularly concerned about British policy in Ireland. It contained people like William Lovett, who solely wanted to confine himself to political changes and not to social ones. It contained a group which met in London who were known as the Rotundists, and that group within the Chartists, I wasn't in it, don't you know, that group within the Chartists, they argued that there should be some degree of social reform, but they weren't very clear about what it should be. Indeed, it would be untrue to deny that the Chartist movement was dominated by those sections of it which were primarily concerned with a very limited reform of the franchise. But there were others in it. These others were a minority, certainly. They were vague, perhaps, in some of their views. But these Chartists were embryonic socialists, and it is their major contribution to the development of socialist thought to which I want to spend time concentrating on this evening. But first, let me just deal with 2 things. The main aim of the Chartists was universal manhood suffrage. In short, the vote for all men. This, they argued, would allow workers to have access to political control. I've already pointed out that the ruling class could never grant access to political power and still be sure of the security of their property. So they resisted the 3 great Chartist petitions of 1839, 1842 and 1848. In 1842, when the biggest of the petitions was sent to Parliament, only 42 votes could be scraped up in Parliament even to hear the petition being read. In 1848, when there was a supposed mass demonstration of the Chartists at Kennington Common in South London, the police and militia sent thousands and thousands of their ranks along to try to outmaneuver the demonstrators. And Chartism ended by the end of the 1840s without having won its objective. Speaking in Parliament against the 1842 petition, Macaulay made quite clear why votes for workers was something that was simply not acceptable. And it's worth hearing Macaulay's reason for opposing giving the vote to workers.
I am opposed to universal suffrage. I conceive that civilization rests on the security of property. Therefore, we can never, without absolute danger, entrust the supreme government of the country to any class which would, to a moral certainty, commit great and systematic inroads against the security of property. The petition asks for supreme power. In every constituent body throughout the empire, capital and accumulated property is to be placed absolutely at the foot of labour. How is it possible to doubt what the result will be?
So Chartism failed. The ruling class would not have any of it. And arising out of this failure to obtain democratic reform of capitalism, it's claimed by conventional historians of Chartism that what they call the left wing of the movement abandoned the struggle for the vote for other pursuits, such as a general strike and, in particular, violent insurrections. And several modern leftists who reject the idea of change through the ballot box because they are fundamentally undemocratic and do not believe in the idea of majority transformation of society, they see this so-called left wing of Chartism as having taken the correct, more revolutionary road. Well, it's worth considering where this road led. It is indeed true that the failure of the Chartist petitions aroused feelings of desperation amongst the Chartist organisers. You've got to realise that after these petitions failed, the state responded with brutality, which certainly hasn't been experienced in any of our lifetimes here. It responded by imprisoning hundreds and hundreds of Chartists, including, incidentally, Bronterre O'Brien. Young, impulsive men within the movement began to devise schemes for nationwide insurrection. George Harney, who was a devoted admirer of the French Jacobin Marat, wrote in the London Democrat in April 1839,
"Men of the East and West, men of the North and South, your success lies with yourselves. Depend upon yourselves alone and your cause will be triumphant. The 6th of May is approaching. Prepare, prepare, prepare. Listen not to the men who would preach delay. In the 2 or 3 weeks you have remaining, let me exhort you to arm. I mean you that are yet unarmed. For oh, thank God, that tens of thousands of you can now assert your right to be free men. To you that are not so prepared, I say again, arm to protect your aged parents, arm for your wives and children, arm for your sweethearts and sisters, arm to drive tyranny from the soil and oppression from the judgment seat. Your country, your posterity, your God demands of you to arm, arm, arm. Come then, men of the north, from your snow-capped hills. Come then, men of the south, from your sunlit valleys. Come to the gathering. Unite, fraternise, arm, and you will be free."
Well, as you imagine, George Harvey wrote that when he was just about to fall asleep one night. But it's dangerous. It's dangerous stuff. It's dangerous stuff, and it's repeated again now, because workers began to listen to it. Desperate workers who felt that they couldn't ever get access to the state, they could never get democracy, they began to take him up, and they began to arm. And in Newport, in South Wales, the Chartist John Frost led a pitiful failure of an insurrection, hoping that rumours of gathering working-class armies in Bradford, Birmingham and all over Wales were true. Frost led several thousand Monmouthshire miners in an attempt to seize Newport by a night attack. Rain delayed the insurrectionaries arriving at Newport, and the government troops, who were safely sheltered in the Westgate Hotel, fired on the marchers as they entered into Newport. For 20 minutes, the miners tried to storm the hotel, and they did not give up until 14 of them were shot down and many more were injured. 125 workers were subsequently arrested, and after the Newport Rising, the state had the reason it had been waiting for, to stamp down hard on the Chartist movement, rounding them up, locking them up, and preventing them from taking any kind of organisational work. So the modern daydream insurrectionaries of the left would do very well to learn the lesson of the Newport Rising, because the failure of such adventures is not simply that people are disappointed, it is, of course, that people are killed. But to see such a policy as being the contribution of the Chartist socialists, as many historians would call it, the left wing of Chartism, is to misunderstand the thinking of that wing of the movement, and in particular of men like Bronterre O'Brien. Now, as so little has been written about O'Brien, let me give you some of the details about him. He was born in Longford in Ireland in 1803. His father was a merchant who went bankrupt during Bronterre's childhood and soon afterwards died of poverty. O'Brien, who was an outstanding mathematician when he was at school, got a job teaching in a public school at Edgeworth. And after that, he went on to Trinity College, Dublin. There he gained a scholarship to go to the University of London and study law. Having a desire to see social change, O'Brien soon became bored by the sterility of legal studies, and he became acquainted with the two most prominent London radicals of the time, William Cobbett and the famous Orator Hunt, the great speaker of the early radical movement. And as O'Brien later wrote, I came to London to study law and radical reform. My friends sent me to study law. I took to radical reform on my own account. Having a natural love of truth and as natural a hatred of falsehood, I soon got sick of law, and I gave all my soul to radical reform. I feel as though every drop of my blood, I feel as though every drop of blood in my vein was radical blood, and as if the very food I swallowed undergoes a process of radicalisation. Well, we know how he felt. What was the essence, then, of Bronterre O'Brien's radicalism? In October 1830, the radical publisher Henry Hetherington appointed O'Brien as the editor of a new journal. This was to be a journal which was to be unique for the times, in those times I should say, because it avoided the Stamp Act, which had been legislated by Lord Liverpool's government in order to make all publications out of the reach of working class people. Because if a journal didn't cost 7pence, it couldn't have a stamp. The Poor Man's Guardian, which was the journal formed by Hetherington and O'Brien, was sold defiantly at the price of 1 penny, and each issue had written on the front, "We do not pay the Stamp Act, we are here to prove that right is greater than might." In this journal, which lasted for 5 years, O'Brien developed a theoretical critique of the profit system, which won many adherents within the Chartist movement, who wanted to go beyond political reform towards social transformation. And I would argue that this wing of the Chartist movement, small though it was, and not particularly distinct though it was, this wing were the direct political ancestors in the British working class movement of the revolutionary socialists of today. In October 1833, the Poor Man's Guardian reported that, quote, "A spirit of combination has grown up among the working class, of which there has been no example in former times. A grand national organisation, which promises to embody the physical power of the country, is silently but rapidly progressive, and the object of it is the sublimest that can be conceived, namely, to establish for the productive classes a complete domination over the fruits of their own industry." In other words, early ideas of socialism, and they were spreading fast. The best way to demonstrate the clarity of political understanding on the part of Bronterre O'Brien and the Poor Man's Guardian is to let you hear some of what O'Brien wrote. To begin with, O'Brien rejected the myth, which is still prevalent today, that the problems of the working class are somehow attributable to human nature. O'Brien wrote, "All the crimes and superstitions of human nature have their origin in this cannibal warfare of riches against poverty. The desire of one man to live on the fruits of another's labour is the original sin of the world." Unlike those radicals who saw the inequality of capitalism as being caused by corrupt individuals and bad governments, Bronterre O'Brien took a class analysis of politics. He was the first radical thinker in Britain to do so in this sense. He wrote, "The error which appears to us to be one of the most formidable barriers to human improvement is that of imputing to individuals the glory and the guilt of those political acts and systems of government which are in reality the work of whole classes, and in the execution of which the individuals are but the chosen tools or instruments of these classes." Now, it's not only the correctness of these ideas that I'm pointing towards, but it is the remarkable fact that they were published in Britain in 1835, 8 years before Marx wrote his first significant work, and a decade and a half before anything of Marx's was published in Britain. Unlike those radicals who were taken in by the fraud of the 1832 Parliamentary Reform Act, O'Brien and the Poor Man's Guardian rejected the view that workers should assist their capitalist masters in their political ambitions. The cause of workers must be kept separate from that of the capitalist middle class, said O'Brien. The Poor Man's Guardian referred to the 1832 bill, which workers were being urged to riot in the streets in support of, as, quote, a wicked, tyrannous, dishonest and diabolical measure. O'Brien warned those workers who were campaigning to give the vote to their masters that, quote, you will be starved to death by thousands if this bill passes and thrown onto the dunghill or onto the ground, naked like dogs. And when you consider the growth of the workhouses which were enacted after 1834 by their political masters, that is not wrong. The anti-working class policies of the Whig government only attracted more and more support towards O'Brien's section of the Chartist movement. The Poor Man's Guardian had no doubts about the class nature of the capitalist state. They did not need Marx to tell them that the state was nothing more than the executive committee of the ruling class. Look at what Bronterre O'Brien wrote about it. Up to this moment, he wrote, all governments of the world have been nothing but conspiracies of rich against poor, of the strong and cunning to keep in subjection the weak and ignorant. The present government of England is of this sort. And we need only echo that. The present government of England is of this sort. So, like the Socialist Party today, O'Brien realised the importance of the vote. He realised, in the same way that the Socialist Party expresses this, and our particular expression of this in the Declaration of Principles of this party, in the 6th clause, shows very clearly the case for democratic revolution. And I quote what that is, that as the machinery of government, including the armed forces of the nation, exists only to conserve the monopoly by the capitalist class of the wealth taken from the workers, the working class must organise consciously and democratically for the conquest of the powers of government, national and local, in order that this machinery, including these forces, may be converted from an instrument of oppression into the agent of emancipation. And it is for this reason, the same one as the principles of the SPGB, that O'Brien opposed the claim of the Owenites that industrial combination, that forming trade unions, can eradicate the essential contradictions of capitalism. For Bronterre O'Brien, trade unions were at best defensive bodies, but they could not change society unless they adopted political aims. As he wrote in 1834,
the trade unions have combined for objects of practical utility. We hailed these coalitions as among the most glorious signs of the times. But it is one thing to conclave, and another to effect the objects of the combination. To effect these, something more is required than the mere power of a strike. What do the trade unions seek? Increase of wages and diminution of the hours of labour. Who does not see that this is to attack property? To attack property is to attack robbery. But how are we to attack it in the safest and most expeditious manner? We cannot attack it by law, for the property class holds the law in its own hand. In our opinion, the trade unions have hit upon the best way of striking property on the head, provided only that they add universal suffrage to their present avowed objects.
But what Bronterre O'Brien and his embryonic socialist wing of the Chartist movement were after was not the vote for the vote's sake. They weren't in favour of democracy as an abstract ideal. Workers needed the vote in order to establish a new social order. And Bronterre O'Brien was very clear about this. In fact, it was he who formulated the slogan of his wing of the Chartist movement, which was called the Charter and Something More. In other words, not just the vote, but beyond the vote, what are you going to do with it? O'Brien may not have been fully aware of how such a new social order could be organised. He may indeed not have been particularly clear about the process of revolutionary change. He was undoubtedly very much influenced by working class ideas which had been prevalent during the French Revolution, and particularly the conspiratorial ideas of Babeur. But he certainly never tired of explaining the case against private property and the democratic method by which its abolition could be sought. He was a democrat and understood that the transformation of society in the interest of the majority had to be carried out by the majority, just as socialists are saying today. As you know, by the end of the 1840s, the Chartist movement was crushed. Many of its organisers were languishing prisons. Lovett fell prey to the disillusion which had intellectually destroyed so many radicals. Fergus O'Connor, the Irish militant who had dominated the movement in so many ways, was driven by failure into the asylum for the insane. And incidentally, many other workers during the course of history have been driven into that course by their inability to make any progress in changing by persuasion other workers' ideas. Many workers who had placed their faith in Chartism went into a long period of apathy, a period which I would argue went from the beginning of the 1850s right the way through to the end of the 1870s, a period of apathy and complacency and conservatism within the working class movement. Engels accurately described what happened during this period. The working class of Great Britain, he wrote, for years fought ardently and even violently for the People's Charter. It was defeated, but the struggle had made such an impression upon the victorious capitalist class that this class, since then, was only too glad to buy a prolonged armistice at the price of ever-repeated concessions to the working people. In other words, the era of capitalist reformism had commenced. The capitalist class had learnt a lesson. Buy off the workers with reforms, offer them concessions, and you will gain in return their acquiescent and conservative support. But it will not surprise you, perhaps, to know that the one section of the Chartist movement which outlived the movement itself was that which adhered to the early socialist ideas of Bronterre O'Brien. Indeed, even as late as the 1870s, when workers in Britain were once again beginning to be concerned about socialist ideas, the name which was revered more than any other name in the labour movement, and William Morris tells us all about this, writing in the 1880s, was Bronterre O'Brien. Many workers, old men by then, coming into the Social Democratic Federation and the Socialist League in the 1880s, where did you learn your socialism from? Bronterre O'Brien taught it to us in the Chartist movement. And it's not without reason that this early theoretician of the working class movement was known as the Chartist schoolmaster. As late as 1851, O'Brien's protégé, Harney, who incidentally had probably far less developed ideas than O'Brien, he was publishing this journal, The Red Republican. It lasted for about 2 years in 1850. And the editorial of the issue for the 12th of October 1850 is as much a manifesto for socialists today as it was then. And this is what Harney wrote. I say for the proletarians of whom I am one, it is not any amelioration of the condition of the most miserable that will satisfy us. It is justice to all that we demand. It is not the mere improvement of the social life of our class that we seek, but the abolition of classes and the destruction of those wicked distinctions which have divided the human race into princes and paupers, landlords and labourers, masters and slaves. It's not any patching up and cobbling of the present system we aspire to accomplish, but the annihilation of that system and the substitution in its stead of an order of things in which all shall labour and all enjoy, and the happiness of each guarantees the welfare of the entire community. Have the majority of the proletarians also authorised me to speak for them? No. Am I sure that I speak the sentiments of even a minority formidable in numbers? No. Sneer not, no doubter. My words herald the future. The mutterings of the present but presage the hurricane roar of the coming time.
How much was the ideas of the ruling class? You said about putting standbacks on and trying to oppress the at that time, and they were trying to pull the jobs, and then they succeeded. How much of those ideas was based on their own class consciousness and looking at the revolutions that preceded in France? How much were they really worried that this revolution was a real fear?
I think they were mainly worried about the idea of a French Revolution type situation, and they studied it very carefully. There were numerous works published in Britain in 1790s, for example, against the French Revolution and the democratic ideas which existed at that time in France. To take one example, Edmund Burke had for many years been the leading spokesman for parliamentary reform, because Burke argued that there should be a reform of Parliament allowing more seats to be given to the smaller aristocracy. Burke was in fact the kind of representative of a group within the 18th century British ruling class, a minority group known as the Rockingham Whigs, who were attempting to get into some kind of power in British society. What happened was the French Revolution caused Burke to completely change his thinking, and this happened with most of these moderate reformers. As soon as and because Burke wrote his famous work, Reflections on the French Revolution, and many other moderate reformers went right away from reform because they thought if reform was going to lead to something like that, they didn't want it. And you've got to realise there was some understandable reason for it, because even though in 1789 the French Revolution seemed like a good idea, it seemed, in the same way as in 1917 the Russian Revolution seemed to many radically minded like a good idea. Just like the Russian Revolution turned into a very nasty and brutal revolution within a very short time. By the early 1790s, the French Revolution had turned into the dictatorial rule of the Jacobins and the control of society by tyranny. And there were many people who said that's what happens with reform. Meddle with the state of affairs and you end up with who knows what. And they really did think that. And they also really did think that it was wrong to allow the working class into power. One of them argued, a fellow called George Pitt wrote a pamphlet saying, look, if you give the working class the vote, they won't know what to do with it, and they'll be open to bribery by different factions of the capitalist class, which in fact is what has happened. Because since the working class has got the vote, capitalists have had to spend millions and millions of pounds bribing workers to vote for one capitalist faction against another. And you can understand that point of view. But by and large, it must be said that many workers themselves were opposed to any kind of major change. So, yes, there was to a great extent a degree of class consciousness. The Stamp Act was certainly a class-conscious act. The anti-combination laws, which banned trade unions until 1825, was certainly a class-conscious move.
How was that sort of initiative that resulted in so many people actually assembling and coming? How that sort of initiative which had been building up through the 1840s and before that, how was that dissipated? And you said before that in between the 1848, 1852 and until the end of the 1870s, that there was a big lull. How was that redirected, rechanneled at that time?
There were two things. One was that it was simply done by brute strength on the capitalist class. In other words, it was done by intimidation. By the end of the 1840s, the average worker knew that if he protested, he was likely to get his head smashed in. And that's like somebody in years to come is going to say, how did the blacks in South Africa sit back for so long and allow this to carry on? The simple answer was they were scared. Secondly, Engels' point, a very important one. The capitalist class began to learn the trick of bribing workers. They began to learn it's actually cheaper to give concessions in the form of reform rather than to have armies on every street corner. After all, for example, I was talking about the Newport Rising. Somebody wrote a research paper which I read some time ago. I don't actually agree with it, but it might be true. And he was arguing that the whole of the Newport Rising was actually started up by government spies. And the whole Chartist movement was dominated by spies, by needs to use government intelligence services to prevent workers from doing it. And the ruling class learned that reform was the answer. Reform kept the workers quiet. In the words of Engels, they bought an armistice. The third, where did it go? In terms of the kind of workers who tended to dominate Chartism, who were the skilled working class, it tended to go into the it tended to go into the new model unions, what are called the new model unions, which started up in the 1850s, which were organisations like the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, who were very respectable, anti-strike. They didn't talk in terms of class. And it wasn't until, in fact, the end of the 1880s, but it happened a bit sooner than that you started to get non-skilled workers forming unions at the beginning of what was called the new unionism. And the thing about it is that one of the important things to understand about the 19th century is, of course, there was a constant change in class composition in terms of the working class. In other words, in the 1830s, there were very, very few people who were working in the kind of large-scale factory production which existed by the 1870s. So it was a change in the composition of the working class and where workers were and how they were living, which also affected things. But another important thing was, a very important thing was in 1870, it became compulsory for workers to go to school, and working class children to go to school and have some form of elementary education. And the majority of them after 1870 started to do that, so that by the 1890s you started to have a number of people around the age of 20 who could read and write. And because in the period of Chartism that existed far less. Class struggle isn't a static thing. The class struggle always goes on whether workers and capitalists want it to or not, but the class struggle changes its form all the time. There's a constant, sometimes it intensifies, sometimes it's far less. And the 1830s was an intense period of class struggle. The 1850s and the 1860s was undoubtedly not that. And, it seems to me that those rather silly and to some extent dishonest historians who claim to be Marxists, who argue that the late 1860s was a big period of working class militancy because the First International existed, that strikes me as to be completely incorrect, because in fact the majority of British workers who had anything to do with the First International were opposed to the ideas of Marx anyway, and they themselves constituted a very small minority of the working class anyway. But that's sidetracking. The fact of the matter is it was diverted into new model unionism, support for reforms, support for the Liberal Party, and of course after 1867 support for the vote. The vote was given to many workers. After 1867 the vote was given to many workers in a apparently great tactic by Disraeli. He decided to beat the Liberals at their own game and give the workers the vote. And in one of the very rare, one of the unique occasions of justice for the working class in history, or justice to the ruling class in history, what actually happened was that the workers had to be given the vote by this great political manoeuvre by Disraeli and the Tories. They used the vote to get rid of Disraeli and let the Liberals. And that served him right.
Steve, I noted that in the talks you did mention, you did want the left wing and other agitators to take example from the Newport insurrection and things like that. May I ask, what other means will John Frost have used to achieve his aim at the time?
Well, I think Bronterre O'Brien's right. What I think John Frost and other workers who wanted some kind of democracy should have done was to have simply used trade union power. This has always been the Marxist position. It's certainly the position which I think is the only reasonable one you can put to. If you take workers in Russia, let's not talk about past, let's talk about now. Take workers in Russia or workers in Chile or workers wherever they may be, where they are in a position where they simply cannot have access to the state. There are no free elections. You can't organise meetings like this. The only answer has to be to use the strength you've got in the trade unions to say, and it's the only last final answer that the working class has got when it comes to a real test of power. To simply say, if you do not give us that degree of freedom, we will not work. And of course, that is the answer which this party put to workers in Eastern Europe for many years. And of course, when it happened a few years ago, that workers in Poland, to some extent, and there are all sorts of criticisms one might make of the Solidarity trade union, but to some extent, that's what they did. They said, look, it's no good organising in little political groups opposing the government and getting shot down for it. If you organise a trade union, you hit them where it hurts. Because the one thing they need the working class for is to produce the golden egg of profit. And if you stop laying the golden egg, they can't just shoot, they can't shoot you. They've got to do something about it. And that's what Bronterre O'Brien's answer was, and that's what I would agree with. The problem with what John Frost did is exactly the same as anyone. It would be like, it's very easy. I remember during that period, a year, 2 years ago, when Solidarity was existing in Poland, there are all sorts of people, brave people. It's easy to be brave when you're a long way away from the action, saying what you should do is arm the trade union members, take on the state. All you get is broken heads. All you get is the state using the most terrible repression to stop that happening. Because if the state has got the arms, there's nothing you can do as a minority to take it on. There's nothing you can do as a majority to oppose the state even, as long as you leave the power of armed force in the hands of the state. And that, of course, is a terribly tragic lesson which the workers of Newport learned. And it's a lesson which I'm afraid other workers today are going to learn. Workers who talk a lot about the need for minority violent revolution, they're simply going to learn that the only lesson of that will be broken heads and martyrs. So Frost should have looked towards the trade unions. That was the answer then, and that is the answer now in areas where workers have not got the opportunity to oppose, to have any kind of access to the capitalist state.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, it seems that this early wave of early socialist thought in the 1830s and afterwards, not only did you say it was partly inspired by the French Revolution, or elements within the French Revolution, would there be any sense in suggesting that the enthusiasm and the positive nature of this early wave was inspired partly by the fact that capitalism itself was a much younger system, had not been as firmly entrenched and established as it is perhaps now? And in that sense, that they had that advantage then, in one respect, compared with us now, that they were dealing with a system which, after all, the French Revolution itself was a capitalist revolution, had taken place only, 40 years before some of the publications you were quoting were published. And consequently, if that's taken as as marking the beginning of modern capitalism in France, at least, they were criticising a system which was fairly recently established. And also, on a similar note, I've heard of the slogan of abolish the wages system, not in fact having been coined first by Marx later on in the century, but I think I've heard of this slogan being used even earlier on by workers. Some possibly saying this in a sort of reactionary sense. They didn't like the new capitalist wages system, and in fact, in some cases, possibly even wanted to go back to something which had existed before the wages system was developed earlier on. But is there any sense in that analysis?
Yeah, well, there's probably some sense. Your first point is probably correct, that because capitalism was a newer system, workers, as you say, were, in that sense, they thought it might be something that wouldn't last as long. If they knew then, we'd still be sitting here now, agreeing with the things that they were saying then. They'd have felt as depressed then as we feel now. So that's just one of those things. History has, in fact, not worked out the way that they thought it would. But that's a good point. On the point about wage slavery, it's quite true. The whole idea of wage slavery was originally coined as a concept to oppose the idea of not being the breakdown of the old rural peasant community. And that's quite true. But I'll tell you something interesting, and I don't know whether the particular standard is at the back, and I wouldn't really do advertisement articles which I've written, but there is, all proceeds go to the party, so it's okay. There was actually an article which I wrote about 6 months ago, or a year ago, which was dealing with a correspondence in that journal, which I've got here, called the Red Republican. And in that journal, incidentally, Harney was a man who published the Red Republican between 1850 and 1851, and he changed the name of the journal after 1851 to the Friend of the People. And Harney would allow anyone to write for it. Well, that sounds like a good thing. But Marx, who was a little bit intolerant about this sort of thing, he didn't like the idea of Harney allowing everyone to write for the Red Republican. There are articles in it by Mazzini, by various French revolutionaries and so on. And in fact, Marx nicknamed Harney Comrade Hip Hip Hooray, because Harney would cheer at every demand that any worker made anywhere. As long as it sounded radical, Harney would appear to be supporting it, and Marx gave him this nickname. There was a correspondence, which I discovered one day when I was sitting in front of the bound volumes of the Red Republican, looking with nothing better to do with my time than look through it. I noticed a correspondence sent in by a man called George Smith, and the heading was Abolition of Money. And he, in fact, wrote this article, this letter rather, to the Red Republican saying radical reform is a good idea, but what we ought to do, in fact, is to abolish money. And this caused a whole series of letters in reply. I think there were about 8 or 10 of them in all. They're all referred to in that article which I wrote. And it was a very interesting example of how, in the early days of capitalism, some of the features of capitalism which we've now grown to believe are inevitable, or we haven't, but most workers have, like the existence of money and the existence of wages and the existence of governments and so on. In those days, they were being questioned and thought about. And as I say, that I don't remember which socialist standard that article is in, but I did write something up on it.
In your talk, I noted that you criticized Edmund Burke, the parliamentary. To some extent, you did say that he was a defender of capitalist system. As I've gotten, I think I read somewhere that actually Burke wasn't concerned with capitalism as such, but with social reform, things like rule of law, human rights. Was it not Burke not right when he said that if power were to be given to the working class, a certain amount of anarchy would set to society? That I read from the history. Was it not right if the power were given to the workers of the state, as in those times I was talking about? Should we not see exactly what we are seeing today in the labor movement of our age? Would it be a different thing from what we were going to do?
Yeah, it's an interesting... You remind me, as you were saying that, of something that Quinton Hogg once said, or then became Lord Hailsham. He made a point which has got a sort of a germ of truth in it. He said, in the 19th century, when the working class didn't have the vote, you had far more tolerance towards workers and social reform enacted by the ruling class than you've had since workers have had the vote and they've had the opportunity to vote their own oppressors into power. And to some extent, there's a certain kind of truth in that you can almost say that workers have, to some extent, created a system of oppression which is even worse in some ways than that which was simply imposed from above. However, that's not entirely a serious reply. The real reply to that is, of course, anarchy is a relative conception. I think, of course, that everybody having enough food to eat is not a system of anarchy. But, of course, if you ask a policeman or a soldier guarding the large mountains of food in somewhere like India or Bangladesh, he would consider it a state of terrible anarchy if the workers and peasants broke through the lines and the barriers and started taking the food for themselves. So, of course, when it comes to it, Burke's conception of anarchy, from his particular class standpoint, was a correct conception of anarchy. What I would argue is that, in fact, and this raises another point, and it's a very important point for socialists, that we are not talking about the rule of the mob. Socialism doesn't mean the rule of an uneducated, politically ignorant majority, because an uneducated, politically ignorant majority are not going to be able to run society in a fashion that's going to be in anyone's interest. We're talking about the rule of conscious, determined, aware people who know what society is all about. They know that you've got serious jobs to do. in society. You've got to create food for people to eat and clothing to wear and shelter. And therefore, you're right in one sense that had the working class simply been told, here is power on a plate, you're in charge, there would have been a degree of anarchy, because socialism presupposes a level of consciousness which allows those who are going to inherit the control and ownership over society to use that wisely. And that, of course, is what we're after. In that sense, of course, Burke had a point. But I think you're wrong, in fact, in what you say about Burke being interested not primarily in capitalism, but in the rule of law and so on. He was interested in that. Burke was a very, very devoted supporter of the private property of the class which he represented, and which, incidentally, he was paid by. Burke was not a man of very large private means. Burke was, in fact, employed to put forward the views that he did by a particular group within the Whig Party, which was dominated by the Earl of Rockingham. And in fact, most of Burke's early writings were simply, fairly irrelevant to the present day. They were manifestos for the Rockingham Whigs. In other words, in 1770, I don't know whether you particularly want a brief lecture on 18th century history, but during the the early years of the 18th century, the Whig group, led by the Duke of Newcastle, was in control. And for a brief period after 1760, when George III became the king, he threw out the Newcastle Whigs and he appointed a new controller over the state, a man called the Earl of Bute. And for 10 years, the Newcastle Whigs were out of control. They didn't have access to the state. And this so incensed the Newcastle Whigs and the younger group within them, the Rockinghams, that they argued that there was a state of anarchy and that everything was going wrong and the state was about to crumble. And as a result, in 1770, they got Burke to write a book called On the Present Discontents, in which he argued in absolutely historically incorrect terms that the years between 1760 and 1770, when the Newcastle Whigs weren't in control, were years of anarchy and chaos and terrible times for Britain. In fact, Burke was very largely the representative of a particular section of the ruling class, and was one of the most. It's not a coincidence, incidentally, that there is a Tory party central office booklet which is called The Case for Conservatism. And in that, it says every Conservative ought to read the works of Edmund Burke at least once every 2 years. I once quoted this in a debate, incidentally, against a young Conservative, and I said, even, we're accused of being dogmatists, reading away at Marx. Even, our head office doesn't send out instructions saying you've got to read the works of Karl Marx every 2 years, but it says you've got to read the works of Burke every 2 years. And if there is one person who is admired by the modern Conservative Party, it's Edmund Burke. In fact, again, I once mentioned to a Conservative opponent in a debate that Margaret Thatcher was, in one sense, the Burke of the 20th century.
You started off your talk earlier by explaining how the ruling class, in order to defend their property, have to try to prevent those who do not have any property from having access to the state. In other words, that property and democracy are ultimately incompatible. And yet we ended up with the point that in 1867 the vote was granted by Disraeli to many workers. Obviously, this did not lead, in fact, to property being abolished, and hasn't done it yet since then. Although you could explain this simply in terms of the fact that the working class hasn't yet developed the consciousness to do that, I do wonder about the sort of reasons, the motivation coming from Disraeli, for example, in doing that. If the vote was granted to these workers, was it simply a lack of foresight, ultimately, on the part of the capitalist class, that they granted the vote despite the point that you opened your talk with?
Yeah, I think it was foresight. I think it's simply a question, you can't hold things back forever. I mean, it's exactly the same reason why, at the beginning, in the 1880s, there was a major, we're going to go on to that next week, but there was a major development of socialist ideas in Britain, or semi-socialist ideas in Britain, you might say. And as a result of that, it became the fashion towards the beginning of the 20th century for many capitalist reformers to call themselves socialists. There's something about political vocabulary that sometimes, the thing to do is you say, well, look, I don't actually like the idea, but I'll accept the label because it's a fashionable one. I don't actually, you get this, you've seen Liberal Party conferences, haven't you? And they say, we don't actually like the idea of socialism, we don't even know what it is, but, we'll use a term, we'll call ourselves socialists of sorts or whatever. It's a thing if a term becomes fashionable. And it's exactly the same. There was a group there was one in the 1820s, but a more important one in the 1860s, who were known as the Tory Democrats. And the Tory Democrats simply argued, you've got at a certain point to give way. One of the most striking examples of this that I know of, I think it was in 1834, but somebody can correct me if I'm... No, I am wrong. Anyway, I thought it was in 1834, where there was a document issued called the Tamworth Manifesto. It was in 1834 by Robert Peel, and who was later to become the Tory Prime Minister. And Peel argued in the Tamworth Manifesto the time of Tories simply refusing to accept reforms, the Tory party being a party of reaction and anti-democracy, this isn't going to work anymore. And the Tamworth Manifesto said, from now onwards, the Tory party, or the Conservative Party as it became known after that, is a party of reform. It's a party that accepts change. It's got to happen. And in fact, Edmund Burke wrote about this. Edmund Burke, in a famous passage in his Reflections on the French Revolution, said, I paraphrase it, change is okay as long as it happens slowly and as long as it doesn't do too much damage to the basic institutions of society. Let it occur slowly. And if you're an enlightened capitalist politician or a capitalist, that's the way to think. After all, it's a silly capitalist like George Ward at Grunwick who don't let trade unions be set up. It's a silly capitalist who comes out in the open and says workers should not have the vote. It's a silly capitalist like the MP for wherever it was, who I was hearing about on the radio yesterday, who made statements saying that most workers on the dole are spending their money in pubs and they're fiddling the state and they could get jobs if they wanted them. People don't say that anymore. If they're sensible. The sensible Tory, the sensible Labourite, is a compassionate man. The Jim Pryors and the Roy Hattersleys, the people who kind of smile at you while they stick the knife in your back. That's the way capitalism has to work. And that's what the Tory party recognised. And of course, in a sense, the argument was, why hold them at the end of the barrel of a gun if you can get them to vote for their own oppression? After all, if you can get them to do it themselves, if you don't need to force them, why pay for a dictatorship when you can get the workers to do it themselves? And that happened. The problem with that, and I don't want to go into this too much because it's covering ground which is a completely different subject and the more contentious one, but the problem with that is that when it comes to a capitalist crisis, I personally, and I'm not expressing necessarily a view of the Socialist Party here, but I personally don't think the capitalist class can maintain that policy. It's my view that what happens when you have a long capitalist crisis, possibly like the one we're in now, the capitalist class simply cannot pay for that kind of liberal democracy. And my argument, although I don't want to cause a debate about it now, is that what happens in those situations, and what probably will happen in this situation, is that the capitalist class simply pull back on that and don't even maintain the pretense of democracy.
Can I just come back on one or 2 points there? Do you mind? Just two brief points following on from that. One thing is when you say that it was a question of giving in at some point and so on. The odd thing about that seems that in 1867, when the vote was granted, Chartist agitation had died out about 20 years earlier. And can I just add a second question to that, which comes out of what you said? When you say that in times of capitalist crisis, the capitalist class can't afford to pay for that, earlier on you were saying that using armed force to suppress discontent, repression. You had said earlier on that they found that it was in fact cheaper to run an artificially, supposedly democratic system than it is to pay for the repression.
Well, I'm interested in sticking primarily to the historical points I was making. On the second one, the simple answer I would give to you there is that during a period of crisis, working class discontent becomes such, this is my main point, that I think working class discontent becomes such that it, in fact, probably becomes cheaper to start thinking in dictatorial, fascistic terms than in democratic terms. That's a point of contention, as I say, which even within the Socialist Party there can be arguments about. Some people, and people who are good socialists, have said to me that's an alarmist attitude, an incorrect attitude. It's one which I very firmly hold, but it doesn't, because it's one of those arguments which you can call a predictive one. In other words, talking about what is likely to happen. Frankly, I hope I'm wrong. What I would say about the other point you made is that no, that's not what happened, because in the late 1860s you began to have the growth of a movement of trades councils in Britain, and I would argue that had a very important effect. But no, the main division that occurred, I think, in the 1860s was that you began to have a competition between the Liberals and the Conservatives over who could offer the most appealing reforms. And I think that the argument was that the best way to find out what the working class thought was to test it through the ballot box. I mean, this is our argument as a Socialist Party, that the best barometer of working class consciousness is the ballot box. And of course, this is what the capitalist class thought themselves, and they still do to a great extent. That's why, in the early 1970s, when the capitalist class were divided amongst themselves in Britain over whether or not to join the common market, their argument was, throw it out to the working class, let the working class fight over it and make the decision. And to a great extent, this is a very easy way of finding a kind of an independent arbiter about capitalist problems. Workers are allowed to fight it out between themselves, and in a sense what happens is that, in the various pressure groups amongst workers about which section of the capitalist class should have greater control, it's the workers' heads who get broken. The capitalists are well away from the political scene, not engaging in the debate very often. The argument about should the Falklands War have been fought or should it not have been fought, it was workers who very largely were the ones who were passionately involved in that, far more than many capitalists were. In fact, I would argue, again, it's an independent point of view, but I would argue that the British capitalist class might quite willingly, had it not been for political considerations of what workers would do, simply let the Argentine junta have the Falklands. I think that to a great extent they weren't looking after their own independent capitalist concern. I think that it was the patriotism and nationalism of workers which was the greater political problem. That's not the only reason. In fact, there were important economic reasons why the capitalist class took part in the Falklands War, I should add. In fact, it's a very good article in the Standard about it.
To that this one, see, you mentioned Ricardo's Labour theory of value. How much did that influence the capitalists towards reforms? Because I had this Open University program where, we doing sort of Ricardo's talks, and he seemed to speak about the Labour theory of value that it is, you say it is the workers that produce all the value, and a country should look after its workforce. So how much did that Labour theory of value lead towards reforms?
The answer to that is that the early perception of the Labour theory of value was that the Labour theory of value was not an explanation of how things were, but how it should be. In other words, it was a moral statement. Marx, of course, was simply saying workers are exploited, workers do produce surplus value, the capitalists take that surplus value in the form of rent, interest and profit. The early Ricardian so-called socialists, people who in fact were very often associated with the political ideas of Bentham and Mill and the utilitarians, they were arguing that the Labour theory of value was a theory of what workers ought to have, that workers should have the full fruits of their labour. Many of them also used the idea of John Locke, because John Locke argued that the product of labour should naturally belong to the person who produced it. That was, of course, the idea of the early 17th century rising capitalist class, who, because they were very often entrepreneurs, that was a very good class ideology for them, that they should have what belonged to them and they shouldn't have to give it to the aristocratic state. Later on, it was turned against them, as ideologies invariably are. So that was one of the things about that. It was seen as a moral statement, and pamphlets like Labour Rewarded took the Ricardian idea as a statement of how distribution should take place. But this is the other point. Most pre-Marxist political economy of the post-Ricardian period was a political economy of distribution. So they always saw things as a problem of distribution, not a problem of production. It wasn't until Marx that the problem not of how goods were circulated, but who owned the means of producing them, became the real problem. And of course that's something which these early radicals didn't entirely understand. I'm just reminded of a quick anecdote, incidentally, that somebody who was a very able member of this party, only knew him shortly before he died, Gilbert McClatchy, or the man who used to write Gilmac in the Standard, who wrote that pamphlet on historical materialism. He, in his early days, wanted to become an accountant. And he was going past a second-hand bookstore, and he saw these books on display, and he saw a book called Capital, study of political economy. He picked it up by Karl Marx, bought 3 volumes of it, took it home, read volume 1, read volume 2, halfway through volume 3, and he turned to the person sitting next to him. Christ, you have to know a lot to become an accountant. Of course, when it comes to it, a lot of people have actually thought of things that way. There are even people in the Labour Party today who actually think that what Marx was talking about was giving workers a surplus labour back. That, of course, wasn't the argument. Incidentally, just one final anecdote on that point while I'm at it. There was one person who, when the 10-hour day was being argued for, as you know, Marx's labour theory of value was that, explained in simple terms, if there's a 12-hour day, the last 2 hours were the hours in which the surplus labour was given free of charge in the form of profit. And when the 10-hour day was being argued for, this man said, if the capitalists don't get the extra 2 hours, they won't get their surplus value.